Welcome again. And today we are going to be talking a little bit about the typology of interactivity. Our learning objectives for this session are going to be to compare different techniques that allow us to interact with population health data. For this, we are going to be borrowing from a concept of geovisualization. We're going to introduce the concept. But first, let's think about this. This is what Tufte used to say about visual explanations, image and quantities, evidence and narratives in his book, and says the assessment of change, dynamics, and cause and effect are at the heart of thinking and explanation. To understand is to know what cause provokes what effect, at what means, at what rate, and how there is such knowledge to be represented. This is basically what we want to try achieve. And when we are presenting data, we are telling stories, and we want to tie those elements in time, in space, in the relationship, and be able to demonstrate what sometimes seems to be not that clear, to make it clear to the observer. Then, when we are talking about interaction and we look into the dictionary, is going to be to have an effect upon each other. That's basically to interact. Even a static paper map, in some sense, is going to be considered interactive. It is a stable, complex displays being seen different. If you look at a map, then you are going to start discovering new elements, more details, things that are hidden. And that's going to help you to create even more ideas. But of course, when we are talking about interaction, we can have an active or passive dynamic there. But the most important thing is when we are talking about technology, what makes interaction is not the technology per se, is the interface. And the interface are the things that allow us to communicate with the system. For example, the mouse, the keyboard, the screens, then those things that allow us to input data and receive data back. Then the interface design, it has to be taken into account when we are looking into geospatial visualization and non-spatial visualization. Basically, when we talk about design of dashboards, then we are in the domain of interface design, because we are creating one system that allows us to input data and receive something in return. Then if we think ourselves what kinds of tasks people can engage when they are performing or doing visualization, or in this case geovisualization, that is going to have like the cues that we are going to use. And yeah, I'm going to go in detail in the geo, because geo is geographic. It's about space. It's about things that surround us. Then the first thing is to examine. No, we want to just look what is there and what are the relationship of different elements. Then now we can compare. We can compare on time. We can compare in location. We can compare in different dimensions that we have. Then we have the option, when we are interacting, to reorder or resort things and start to see the world in different ways or in different priorities. Then we can extract or suppress noise, or try to filter or focus in some particular signal. And of course, at the end, we are going to be able to establish that cause-effect relationship. Then basically, this is the pyramid of the kinds of tasks that we are going to be conducting. And for the homework, when we talk about tasks, then the idea is to think about this, no? To think or this level of interaction and how you perform those tasks in that homework. Okay, then if we go and look into the resources, then we can have also types of resources. And those resources can be aligned with functions. Then we can have different domains or forms of resources. We can have images, maps, diagrams, graphs, tables. And we can interact with them in different dimensions, and we can have different functions. It could be a static, animated, sequential, hierarchical, conditional relationship. The thing is, static functions, they're not truly interactive. As we mentioned, even though you can be studying a map and be able to discover new things, and that creates you some kind of reflection, then basically when we start to have animations, when we have to start sequential, hierarchical, conditional interactions or function is when we are interacting really. And these are like different levels that we can have there. Then let's try to start in this concept of typology of interactivity. And we can start with we interact with data representation. When we interact with data representation, we can do several things that we are going to be going in depth, like lighting, viewpoint, orientation, zoom in, zoom out, rescaling, resampling, or remapping symbols. Or we can also interact with temporal dimensions. We can interact with time, and then we can have navigation. We can have flight rules. We can have toggling. We can have sorting or re-expression of the data that we have there. But we can interact also with the data directly, not only with the representation or with the temporal dimension of that data, but we can interact with the data, and then we can create queries. We can do data mining. We can do brushing, and that brushing could be statistical, temporal, or spatial. We can filter, that basically is we exclude some type of data. We can have highlighting, and that's kind of including some data of interest. And we can have contextual interaction as well, and that's to have multiple views of the problem or the data. We can combine data layers. We can have window juxtaposition, or we can have linking of different data sources. Then when we think in the typology, usually when we interact with the data representation, the way that is presented to us, that's a really low level of interactivity. When we interact with dimensions on time, we can say that as a middle level of interactivity. And when we have interaction directly with the data and with the context, then we are going to have a high interaction. Then let's go back and try to review every single of these elements. And let's start with that interaction with the data representation, the way that we present the data and how this help us to understand things or see the world in a different way. Then in this level, the user is going to have different views or different perspectives of the data by manipulating the way that it looks. Basically, when you have a table, you can sort the data by different levels. Okay. And let's switch here gears. And for example, we have this data about child mortality rate, and we have some variables, and we have some countries. And in this case, this data is sorted by country and region. But we want to change the representation and say, hey, what is the country that has the highest child mortality rate? Then I can change the representation of the data and the way that is and the way that is sorted in some way. And they say, oh, Niger is the country with the highest mortality, or the one that will lowest is San Marino, Singapore, and Estonia. And this is just a simple way of interacting with the data representation that allows to have different looks of the data. Then when we have lighting, it's this effect that we have over any scene that can have influence in the way that we interpret the patterns that are there. Then in the previous case, we have some ranges that were being expressed there of the data. But you see that some curves are collecting the whole data, while other curves didn't represent the whole history. And if you see here, some of the countries, they have calculated some of the changes, or we can have uh, different scopes or different lightings, then looking this into, for example, continents, or looking this into income groups, or looking into the countries only, and that's going to change the perspective and how we want to look into that. And that's those are some ways of looking into the data. Then we also have changing the viewpoint of the camera. And this is based on the model of on the metaphor of a model and a camera, that you have a model and you can move the camera around. Then it creates you different views of the data. And a similar the thing that I was showing you, that when you aggregate data, or when you sort data in different ways, you are going to have different stories to tell. The other thing that we can do is orientation of data, and you can change the perspective. Or, for example, if we want to actually look into a map that represents the same data, then going around is giving us some ideas. And here we are going to see that, for example, those colors are going to represent densities, and we can use changing things. Or other levels of interaction is doing zoom in and zoom out. And this category of interaction is when we can look into different details in a map, for example, and the scale changes with the with the zoom that we are doing. Then we are going to have more or less resolution of the data that we are looking at. And then, for example, in this map of Memphis, when we start doing zoom, we see that more detail is appearing, and now we have more streets, and then we have more detail, and then we have the buildings and so on. Then this is a kind of the way that we understand the zoom in and zoom out. Just try to have a bigger picture, or a more detailed interpretation of what is going on with the data. Then Tofte, the same author that we were mentioned before, he says this, that we have the macro and the macro and the micro viewpoint of the data. Then we have the 10,000 feet view, and we can go and look into the detail. Or in the table that presented before, we have the view of the world, or we have the view of the regions, or we have the view of the country. Then two concepts that sometimes are concerned is how we change that scale smoothly, and how to store the data in different scales, no? And that's something that finding that sweet spot is not always easy, but the idea is to allow those users to have that experience, that they have that sense of control on the element. Rescaling is a term that refers to resetting the scale parameters of the data. Then we can have linear, we can have log, or we have graphs that are different, represented in different scales. And then that capability of changing the scale can give us some insights, because sometimes we see something that is linear, that is growing too fast, but if we change the scale to a logarithmic scale, hey, then we see that the behavior is a little bit uh, is a little bit different. And this is something that allows also to tell stories in different way. And of course, when you rescale things, we want to try to have a way that we are going to help to tell this story. And when we are talking about geographical data or geographical applications, usually the data is normalized in the area that we are looking at. Then another example could be uh, this that is about race and income in communities and country, but we can have different scales to represent the data. Then income poor, income rich, the overall income. We can have plurality. We can have different ways of representing the data, and then the scale is going to change based on the area that we are looking at. Then, for example, in that particular case, if we are mapping that race across a city, you want to standardize the number of people in each racial category by the total number that derive the racial densities. And that's what we were looking in the map. Because the number of people living in different enumeration units or different counties in the case of this graph is going to vary widely. Then we want to normalize things, and that's why we use percentage instead of using absolute numbers. And if you see the plurality here, that is the particular graph that we're looking at, is represented in percentage of the in this case of the races of interest. And this is really a fundamental principle in this type of representation of the choropleth map, because the densities are going to inform the color or the shading that we are going to be using. Usually when we have higher density, we are going to be using darker colors, and when we have lower densities, then we are going to be using lighter colors. We can also have this concept of remapping symbols. And the concept of remapping symbols is to change the what a color represents when we have a lookup table. And we need to be aware that certain colors they don't display in certain web browsers, and sometimes we have people that are blind to colors, and that's something that we are going to learn when we learn tools in how to test for that and be able to enhance the contrast, enhance the 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 capabilities to see the data. Trying to bring here a map that maybe you were is not working anymore. All demonstration fails. But if you remember the coronavirus map of COVID, it used to use, instead of density, it used to show the magnitude of the event as circles that were growing or being smaller, and that's another way of remapping the 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 data or the symbol that we are using to represent that. Then, as mentioned, that we can use, instead of color circles, different colors. We can have a heat map, no? That we go from green to red, depending on the story that we want to do that. Or we can have different color schemas that we want to do that. Then now moving to the second level, that is the interaction with temporal dimensions. What we can say here is that this is in that medium level of interactivity, no? And this allows us to have dynamic mapping, and that allows to see how data changes in a continuum. And we can create animated maps, and that's a form of dynamic map where we can have some kind of opportunity to control, or we can have flight throughs where users can control routes, take a speed, altitude, things like that. And then if we want to think about this animation over time, then we can go back to 1932, and the only country that was reporting child mortality at that time was Ghana. But and then Brazil, we start to see reports. We start to see that, oh, it was really high now, because that color density, we can see how people started reporting, and we started to see how mortality started to decrease in some of the countries, and how the public health interventions maybe were effective. And this, if you see, there was a country that just picked up, and this South Sudan. And if we look into the days 2015, and you remember different events that occurred around 10 years ago that can explain that. And then we have another peak here in the Central African Republic, and maybe we can explore other elements of public health or policy that happened at the time to try to create these stories of a causality and effect on these elements that are happening. And if we think about flybys or flight throughs, that's basically an animated journey through a terrain, no? And then we have different frames that terrain that gives the appearance of moving through that landscapes. And to have a really good experience, usually we want to end to 15 to 20 frames per second, and that's because our eye is going to have that illusion of movement. There is no really high interactivity, but it could be presented as an animation that the user can see. And in that regard, for example, here I have a little example of an airplane that is just flying. We can follow the airplane and goes around and it comes back. And we can have these journeys just representing different things, but that's another way of showing those fly-throughs or flybys that represent that journey through the terrain. And usually the route through the data is not necessarily manipulable, but you can manipulate the speed of the animation, you can manipulate the direction going back and forward, you can advance by frame, you can stop the thing and just look what is going on there, and that gives the sense of controlling that finished movie. While the fly-throughs is when the user or the viewer can choose their own route, and finding different decisions, and that's more the behavior of the Google Street View, no? That you can basically have interactions with the map, and then you can have your journey. But of course, here I don't have a data layer that I can use, but depending on the layers that you can have, you can represent different elements in this type of navigation or flight through. When we talk about toggling, is basically switching back and forth between different periods to highlight those changes. And if we go back to the to this map, then basically we can say, hey, we have 38 and 22. Then we can be toggling between those two elements and see the the changes. Another type of interaction that we can have is what we call sorting. And in the mapping environment, we can basically sort things in different ways. And that allows us to identify trends that in other ways can remain hidden. We can sort along timeline. We can sort in one way, alphabetical. Then remember that table that we were sorting through the countries. And we can sort spatially the data to be able to look into different insights of the relationship of that time dimension. Now, when we are interacting with data directly, is when we have basically emphasis on that data. The level of interactive is really high, and then in that way we can identify, discover, and select the pertinent patterns in the data. Then there are four types of basic interactions with data. Then we have the database query and the data mining. The database querying is that you have a predefined question and then you pull that data. But the data mining is an advanced computational technique where you have this data and is capable perhaps of discovering hypotheses and discovering relationships that you cannot see clearly. Brushing is like it says painting, then we can brush and or come the data, we can filter and highlight. Then let's go and look in every single them in detail and what can do them for us. Then as I was saying, the database querying and data mining, we can discover patterns and trends. And data mining is considered like a process of interactive discovery. You can do that manually or you can do that computationally. And data mining does not really test on a hypothesis, but can help you to identify possible relationships, and then you create your hypothesis. And then you can do those analysis to test those relationships, and then that could be your hypothesis in which direction is the relationship established. Then we can do brushing in geographic, statistical, and we can do brushing in temporal data. Then geographic brushing is a long-standing type of interactivity that basically explores correlation between statistical and geographical patterns. And these three brushes are really interlinked because we have the space, we have the data, and we have the time. And we can see how the time bar or the geographic patterns can change, and usually the best way of doing that is by scatter plots, or sometimes we can see that in line graphs, no? And here we have some selections of some countries and some patterns, and then we can see the variable of time and the variable of interest, that is the child mortality rate for this case. The next one is filtering, that it has been presented briefly because it overlaps a little bit with the data representation, but is how we exclude, simplify, or omit some data from the display. And we remove irrelevant or insignificant data from large data sets, and it can help us to identify specific things that we want to do. Then coming here back, and then this is then the next one that is highlighting is basically you can just use this type of interactivity to really make pop up the data of interest that you want to look into and the one that you want to make some emphasis on. This is opposite of filtering because we want to amplify and focus the attention of the observer into that piece of information. Now, moving into the contextualizing interaction, that's that higher level, then is basically given a context in which information is critical to the analysis. You can, the context could be through in a narrow or wide sense, and is basically how data is selected or compared. What are the criteria that you're using to select that? And then you can have different contexts, different cultures, different societies, and that's going to create different frameworks to interpret the data, even though we can use the same tools. No, multiple views, sometimes systems can provide multiple views of the same data. And as we were seeing in the map, that we can have lines, we can have slopes, we can have bars, we can have the map, we can have the table. That's basically that concept of multiple views. It's the same data, just with different representations, but we have this in sequential way in this case because we are clicking through there, but we can create a whole dashboard. We can have multiple of these views coexisting at the same time. The small multiples is another visualization that you may be familiar with, that is kind of this, where we have multiple representations of data that are sharing domains, and then this is a classic example of multiple small multiples, that we have 4 variables using the same scale, but actually in this one we can interact through the years and see how things change, or how we can filter or highlight different information. And again, going back, we can have the data on table, and then that's how we toggle or switch that representation. Then this small multiples has the power to allow us to do comparisons. And of course, that's why we have two more data displays to generate the comparisons, or through variables, or through the locations, or through different observations. And we can use this both for spatial or chronological comparisons. And in the example I was showing you, a chronological comparison. And we can also have reordering or resorting of that spatial data in the way that I was showing you, that you can just select some of the windows of observation, then that's going to help you to focus, or again, brushing or highlighting, or doing different operations over the data. We also have this concept of linked maps, that you can have 2 or more data sets that are interactive, and they can be presented in a map that is interacting. We can have combined data layers, that as a common feature in geographic information systems. And when you combine two or more layers, then that's going to create a new layer. Then you can have the income and travel time to produce a new layer of an average income. And if you remember here, then we can have income, or we can have income from the rich side or income from the poor side. And then this is the combination, or we can have the plurality, or we can just have the density for some of the um classifications that we want to have. And here we have that switch or toggle temporal, and we can also combine other 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 levels, and is going to allow us to create a queries, or as you see, we can have here distance and automatic demographics, things like that. Another function that we can have for that is this window juxtaposition. Then you can have multiple views of the data, and one can be an animation, the other one could be a flight route, the other one could be a cross-sectional different times. And that's the example of a brain scan, for example, that you can have different perspectives of the data that the tool is combining it for you to facilitate the interaction. And linking is that technique to connect or index different data, and 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 not like brushing the linked, not necessarily is going to be dynamic. You can pre-coordinate that linkage, and sometimes it's more intrusive that brushing that we just went before. Now, when we interact with the spatial data, and that's the geographical visualization, I have already provided you some examples. Then basically is when we use that spatial context and make that problem visible to be able to engage with people. And that's a really powerful thing. And when we are talking about population, when we are talking about communities, putting things in the context of the space is really important. Then geographical visualization usually is highly interactive, highly exploratory, and that has been defined by these authors. And it's not a new term. It was created in the 90s. And basically, geovisualization is a method that integrates approaches for visualization in scientific computing, cartography, image analysis, information visualization, explorative data analysis, and geographic information systems to provide theory, methods, and tools for visual exploration, analysis, and synthesis. Then maps or geovisualization are powerful tools to tell stories, and it's really useful to visualize large volumes of data. Okay, and it's really a magnificent tool to tell stories, as I mentioned. Then the context of geovisualization, as we saw, is that we can display data in a dynamic way with different thresholds and looking a correlation between variables. And we can have that map that is going to change over time or over space, and giving us those insights. Then basically the most important thing when we compare the traditional static maps versus geovisualization is that a geovisualization is going to respond to that user input. Basically, it's an interface, as I was mentioning before. We have an input and then we have a response. Also, We can do statistics and dynamically allocate data based on some thresholds or values. We can sort data in different bins and create scatter plots or metrics of that data. And basically, this is a task that is analogous to the sorting the mail in the post office. Then, when you have different levels with different geographical destination, then you put them in different slots or bins. We can also produce visual thinking, and is that it's not to create an ideal map, but it's to provide a way to explore the data and to generate the ideas about the phenomenon that we are seeing, and tell those stories. And of course, we want to be interactive. That was the definition that we were going through, no? And this is a component that we expect to have in the modern spatial temporal visualization solutions, or the geovisualization, no? And of course, a high degree of interactivity is required in geovisualization. Then that's why it's really distinct from static maps. Again, when we interact with maps, increase the enjoyment of that map. And of course, that interactivity usually requires an electronic mapping system. Then I have presented a lot of tools there that are some examples that are free. We are going to be exploring more in the future and more tools to really be able to create our own visualizations. Then interactivity, we expect to be there. And when we see GVIs, or the geo visualization interactions, we want to be really intuitive and basically self-explanatory. And it's really making emphasis in that capability of explore the data and explode those functions of the spatial representation. We really need to be sure when we have interactive geovisualizations that the response needs to be in short intervals, because if we just moved it in and hey, need to load the data and we are waiting there, the user experience is not going to be that satisfactory, and then they're going to say this doesn't work or we don't like it. Okay. And we need to count that concurrency when we have multiple users, how we are going to manage that, and we need to be aware of the capabilities of that server or the system that is going to be providing those elements to be robust enough. But nowadays, even simple computers have the capability and the power to support concurrency importantly. But can you imagine when Job Campus was doing COVID and all the world were looking into that? Yes, you need to be really robust in response for that. And when you have expansions, then you can have browsing, exploration, manipulation, and visualizations. And sometimes you can have that functionality could be restricted or full range. And that's the way that some of these things are premium. No, you don't need to provide everything there, but you can provide some of these uh, elements, or provide focus activity. And when we have that restricted interactivity, basically it's because we want a relatively low degree of interactions, and usually the restricted interactivity is going to be viewing, browsing, and maybe some level of zoom and scrolling across the map. And the comparisons are by make a view of two or more maps in separate windows. But when we have complex levels of interactivity, then we can have interactions directly with the database, and then we can filter things in different ways. And as I was showing you, that we can just go over time over different variables and things like that that are going to be changing dynamically. when we refer to highly interactive geovisualization systems, we are talking about systems that not only incorporate more kinds of interactivity, but that combine more than one type of interactivity. And then we can have more sophisticated inquiries or interactions or transactions. And usually high interactivity geovisualization systems are going to include at least some of the more complex uses that we have identified as the context determining interactivity or the brushing that we presented, filtering, and then you want to have this, okay? And if we want to have those analytical capabilities, then of course it has to be computer based. In that moment, the user is really actively involved, not only in evaluating the spatial data, but also in the visualization of the geographic information. Then in that case, we have the manipulation, engagement, analysis, linking selected data with external information, and doing some graphic redesign of that interactions. Then you can change the camera viewpoint, the data representation, you can filter out your data, you can do a lot of the things, have different layers, and those are really powerful tools that actually they can be at the reach of our fingers with all the capabilities that we have nowadays with open source and open access software. Then when we are thinking about the usability issues, when we are interacting with the spatial data, then we are going to have cognitive issues, especially. People sometimes they don't have clear concept of navigation, or they don't have clear concept of orientation, and can get lost in the process. Then remember that interacting with this two-dimensional representation is not always easy when we are representing in that 2D something that is 3D. Then, for example, being able to do zoom or to manipulate the camera view point, it requires a little bit of understanding of the system, understanding of the assumptions of the interface, and be able to actually be able to control the different elements of the interface. And of course, a less interactive geo-visualization is going to include fewer types of interactivity and fewer opportunities to combine different types. Okay, then to summarize, we discuss different levels of interactivity, the level of the representation, temporal dimensions, interacting with the data and the context, and then we identify that there are low, middle, and high interactivity dimensions. And this is really key for the future, and this is basically the hierarchy that we are going to be using. And just to bring here Monmonier's graphical scripts is he emphasized in great degree in how map interactivity is structured in map uses in particular situations. And basically, the theory says that using interactive maps is akin to conversation and between two or more people, and there is a narrative script which can be framed in the way that we use the map or how we inquire the map. And that narrative metaphor emphasizing the sequence in which the user interacts with the geovisualization environment. That's what can help to create that storytelling that I had been telling. Then the literature justify the reasons for developing this type of typology. is because geographical visualization interaction is conceptually different from traditional static mapping, because we are going to have that high or more powerful interactions. Allows one to identify the difference between computer mapping systems and gives interfaces designers mechanisms to identify needs and measure interfaces effectiveness. That is part of the exercise that we are going to be doing in the future. And of course, when we have decision making as users and we can choose the conditions that we can use in the exploration, then this is a powerful tool. Okay, and this allows us to transition to that more in detail spatial exploration. And at the end, the benefits are going to of this type of typology is that we can combine different types when we are building interactive environments, and identifying them then allow us to, hey, what is the type of story, what is the type of conclusion that we want to help the user to get to, and allows also cartographers or the people that analyze geographic information systems to evaluate or to critique the way that different representations are conveying the message, and gives interface designers and mechanisms to identify needs and measure that effectiveness. I already showed you some example of MapQuest, and that's one of those original mapping tools that we have even before we have Google Maps. And the type of interaction that you can have with the data is highlighting. You can do zoom in, zoom out. You can do window juxtaposition. But we also look into Google Earth. We also look into our walling data. We look into a justice map, and those resources help us to really identify these elements. I hope that this has give you some insights in these different levels of interaction, and then you are going to be able to incorporate these elements in your future discussions. Thank you very much for your attention. Until next time.